Welcome to the first one of the two video recordings on the lecture on the U.S. presidency. When we look at the government systems in terms of the power distribution between national and regional governments, we see that there are three main approaches or three main systems of governance. First one is the so-called unitary system. In this system, there is one national government, and there are either no regional governments or there are some regional governments, but they don't have any authority to make any decisions. They simply follow what the national government instructs them to do. In the second type of system, called the confederal system or confederalism, there is one weaker national government and multiple powerful regional governments. And in the federal government system, there is one powerful national government and multiple weaker regional governments. As you know, the U.S. government is established as a federal system, which means that the U.S. Constitution requires state governments to observe and respect the superiority of the U.S. government and Constitution if and when there is a conflict between the constitutions of a state and the U.S. And this is called the Supremacy Clause. It's a part of the requirements of being in the Union we call the United States of America. On the other side, when we look at the government structures or systems according to the power distribution inside the national government, we see that there are two main systems: parliamentary systems of governance and presidential systems of governance. The differences between these two systems can be summarized as such. In terms of leadership, in a parliamentary system, there is one president and one prime minister. And in a presidential system, there is only one president but no prime minister. So accordingly, the president's role is much more heightened in a presidential system, hence the term presidential system. And the president in such systems both represent and run the government. Whereas in a parliamentary system, president's role is just more of a figurehead role. He or she is simply in charge of representing the government only, but the task of running the government on a day-to-day basis is prime ministers. In Europe, most countries have parliamentary systems, and in the US, we have the presidential system. An example of a parliamentary system, accordingly, would be Germany. This lady on the right-hand side in the picture on the left, Angela Merkel, is the Prime Minister of Germany, or as they call him, their Chancellor of Germany. And she is the person who is running the German government. But the gentleman on the right-hand side is the President of Germany, and his role is more restricted to representing the German government in various international functions, etc. But with no responsibilities in actually running the government. Another difference between the parliamentary and presidential systems is the election of the government leaders. In parliamentary systems, prime ministers who run the government are elected by the parliament. That's why these systems are called parliamentary systems. By the way, the word parliament is the European term for what we call Congress in the United States. Presidential systems, on the other side, rely on the president to be elected by the voters or constituents or the ordinary citizens. But as you very well know, in our current system in the United States, the system of electoral college, the voters do not directly elect the president. They simply make recommendations to a group of individuals called electors, 538 electors, who turn around and cast their ballot to elect the president. So people's role in the election of the government leader is an indirect and reduced role in our current system. In terms of the sovereignty, in a parliamentary system, only the legislative branch is considered to be sovereign, which means that executive and judicial branches are considered to have been born out of the legislative branch. They're almost as the subcategories of the legislative branch. For example, in these systems, most executive branch members come from the members of the legislative branch. There's a very organic link between the three branches in this sense. This is quite a contrast to the presidential system we have in the United States, where all three branches are considered to be sovereign. And to make that happen, sovereign is a synonym for independent, by the way. And to make that happen, members of the two branches, the executive and the legislative branch, are elected in separate elections, whereas the members of the judicial branch are nominated by the president and appointed by the Senate. So that's the way that the checks and balances is designed in the US presidential system. In terms of powers, the parliamentary systems rely on what's called fusion of powers, whereas in presidential systems we have separation of powers. In fusion of powers, you see that the legislative branch's members are actually chosen to sit in the executive branch and run the government. Whereas in a presidential system, as I mentioned, different elections install the members of different branches, executive and legislative, and judicial branch people are actually appointed. So the two systems differ from one another in terms of the ways that the political leader can be removed from office. In a parliamentary system, the leader, which is the prime minister in this case, can be voted out of the office by the legislative branch. So in a voting called the vote of confidence, if the person doesn't pass this voting, it means that the legislative branch or the lawmakers in the society do not have enough confidence in the competence of the political leader, the prime minister, and this is considered to be enough reason to remove the leader of the government from office. We've seen examples of this a number of times in recent years in England, for instance. In the turmoil that followed their decision to exit from the European Union, a number of British prime ministers have to step down as a result of this issue. In a presidential system, on the other side, a president cannot be removed only because the lawmakers don't have any confidence in his or her ability to do his job, with some very minor exceptions, such as if the person is deemed to be mentally unstable or mentally ill somehow, etc., then there are some exceptions. But normally, the only proper way of removing a president in a presidential system, as in the US, is the president committing a high crime or misdemeanor. So president has to have violated the Constitution somehow in a fashion that's significant enough, and the legislative branch then convenes and holds an impeachment trial and removes the president from office. There are certain countries in history, in political history, that changed their system from one way to another. Turkey was the last country that did that. In 2018, they changed their parliamentary system to a presidential system. This gentleman in the picture here on the left-hand side was the Prime Minister of Turkey before this change happened, and so he held a referendum and asked the people of Turkey what they think about this change. People said okay, they gave it a go, and then the constitutional scholars restudied the Turkish constitution. They made necessary changes, and then the parliament, Turkish parliament, voted on this change, which meant that they changed the government system in their country from a system that gave themselves more power to a system that gave this gentleman and his position more power. Now Turkey goes with the presidential system as we have in the United States.